Okay, this is Generous Theology. I am Brock. I'm with my friend Chuck, and Chuck, we have been having a very pleasant meander, as it were, through Herman Bavinck's Reformed Dogmatics, Volume 1. We're in the home stretch here. We're in part 5, talking about faith. In chapter 15, the faith and the theological method. And Chuck, we've spent some time talking about several different schools of theological method that Professor Bavinck identifies and locates in what at least I call the modern liberal humanities, the Geisteswissenschaften, the Jena school and its intellectual descendants. And so we've talked about these modern challenges to the principium internum of faith, this internal principle. And so we've talked about the historical apologetic method. We've talked about the speculative method. We've talked about the religious empirical method. And now today we're in a final section, and we have what's called the ethical psychological method. And Chuck, that's exciting because in some sense, that is perhaps the single largest competitor to Reformed theology today, I would say. And in fact, forgive me for saying it, but I believe it is, of course, significantly more popular than Reformed theology is. In fact, Reformed theology, as well as Christendom in general, really seems like it's been taking a back seat to the developments that have come out of this ethical psychological method. And so it's really valuable to have Professor Bavinck here at the beginning of this movement, documenting it, putting its proportions into place, talking about distinctives, points of attack, where it upsets and turns over the Christian apple cart, to use a phrase, and where in the mind of many moderns and many enlightened secularists, it is the better method. It is the better thing that has replaced what was formerly, called the Christian objectivism. And so that sets the story for us, and the tale is quite interesting. Chuck, what did you think about this section, and do you perhaps see the same ethical sweep of history here? Do you see perhaps that we're still living in that same sort of situation, even in our own lives today, and thus Professor Bavinck's notes in this section are extremely useful and helpful?
Yeah, I agree with you on the sweep of history, of intellectual history, and where that sweep of history has gone, and that this is, a key chapter in describing that. I found it interesting that in a lot of ways, first of all, Bavinck spends a great deal of print space discussing this, right? He's got 25 pages of material on the ethical psychological method. And yet he also points out very early that the ethical psychological method really is very similar to the religious empirical method that we talked about last time. He says they agree in many respects, so much so that they frequently go together or blend into each other. And I think there is some truth to that as you take an initial look at what Bavinck says about each method. You definitely see some parallels. However, I think it's also important to note that I think Bavinck is right to still separate them out. And what he describes as a distinction, he says the distinction consists primarily in the fact that the former, the religious empirical method, is closer to Schleiermacher, and the latter, the ethical psychological method, is closer to Kant. And so the former tends to accentuate emotional experience, while the latter places more stress on ethical self-assertion. And now that phrase, ethical self-assertion, I think we could probably spend hours just unpacking that, but I think that's a key phrase. And I think it's important that he divides these out because realistically there are some differences. And if we whitewash over those differences, we may get some things wrong. We may also be criticized for not quite getting it right, or perhaps using the wrong language when responding to people who hold to one or the other of these methods. And I was thinking about this, and because I was at this event live, normally I would probably, if I had watched it, on video or something, I might have replayed it a few times just to make sure that I'm not making a mountain out of a molehill here. And I may be, but it was worth thinking about. I was at an event last night, actually, at a church in the Milwaukee area that did a wonderful event talking about AI and how does a Christian look at AI, and specifically from the Reformed tradition, how do we deal with AI? And of course, some of what you have to do in dealing with that is, first of all, gain an understanding of what it is and how it works. And so an engineer with some expertise in that area spoke about that. There was also a medical ethicist at the Medical College of Wisconsin who spoke and talked about some of the ethics around it and some of the things that AI has done in medicine that have been positive as well. And then pastor theologian also spoke. And one of the things that I noticed that in one of the presentations, perhaps more than the others, I thought there was a little bit of a sense that there was a conflation of this Schleiermachian worldview. The person who was describing some of the issues around the value-ladenness of AI and where do those values come from, and how do we know what those values are, and can you go directly to those programmers and those kinds of things and their values? Is that what impacted it, or where is that coming from? But in doing a little bit of criticism in thinking about how AI tends to work, he I thought blurred some of the lines between more that Schleiermachian, what Bavinck might have called religious empirical method, although we're not talking about specifically about faith, but that very feelings-based way of looking at things, and the more Kantian approach that maybe fits this ethical psychological method that stresses this ethical self-assertion and is not merely about just simply how do I feel about things. Now, both of them still come out of, and the reason why they do go together, and Bavinck acknowledges that they go hand in hand. And the reason for that is, and this was very well pointed out, I thought, at this event, is that what is at the heart of these worldviews is, basically the importance of the self and the importance of the individual and their own sort of, subjective ideas of themselves, separated from, other relationships, whether with God, of course, but also even as it relates to, human communities and those kinds of things. And, the medical ethicist pointed out that there are some areas where some of those recognitions can play into AI. He talked about sort of these AIs that work with people with dementia and are able to mind them of this, that, or the other thing. And that behind that, there can be something that is more than just about the individual. It adds a level of community. But of course, it is AI and not a human being. And so that was also a key issue here, is what does it mean to be human? And if we limit our thinking about what it means to be human to merely, a physical only, without any transcendental, aspects, without a soul, and that it's just a combination of, how do we think about things, and how does that work, and how do we put together our memories? It can be very, very much possible to then still put the self at the forefront of that, and then start thinking about what is human as being totally separated from who we really are, separated from our being as embodied people, and so then suddenly this idea of, the time coming when the singularity, when we're able to upload personalities up to the web, and suddenly, is that going to be a person? Is this uploaded brain, are they going to qualify, and are they going to have certain rights? Those kind of questions get asked, and realistically, in both this religious empirical method, as it applies to faith anyway, and the ethical psychological method, this Schleiermachian versus this Kantian view of the world, it still comes down to the same problem, which is that at the center of it is me rather than that I am a creature, that my primary relationship is with God, that my primary role in life is to worship God in all of the things that I do, whether it's my day job practicing law, or whether it's the time I spend with my high school students teaching them forensics, or my church high school students, teaching them Bible, or you and I talking about Bavinck. All of that is still, it needs to be done in the context of our being creatures of worshiping God. You and I think it's fair to say, as we have these regular conversations, and are primarily what we're doing, when you just look at things, is we're talking to each other. But even our discussions, Brock, are an act of worship, right? And this ethical psychological method and the religious empirical method before it really ignores all that, ignores that part of our being. And so I think that, and even, Bavinck points out that even in the ethical psychological method, there is this human need for God and for morality. And often there is a sense in which, some of these authors that he talks about later, Pascal and Bavinck, and others as well, they commend Christianity, but yet it's a Christianity that's robbed of its primary purpose. The primary purpose of who we are is worship. To quote the first question and answer of the Westminster Confession, what is the chief end of man? It's to worship God and enjoy him forever, and these methods forget about that. And in forgetting it, even when they claim to be religious, even when they claim to be Christian, unfortunately, I think what happens is we've put the wrong thing at the center, and suddenly, we lose those things that really make our worldview a Christian worldview.
That was really a strong build out here. Now, I think there's an interesting question that we want to ask, which is, why are these four methods even in this chapter? And why these four? And what is happening that Professor Bavinck is trying to document? And so, as I believe Bavinck is trying to communicate to us, we see outlined in these four methods, we see four different dialectical steps that were taken by modern, secular, enlightened persons. Now, I say secular, even though, of course, there are going to be lots of people in here, and I'm thinking primarily of Protestant liberals who wished to maintain what they thought was an authentic Christian faith. And I'm not trying to say that in the sense that I'm throwing them out, but I want to say that in the sense that even the Protestant liberals who wanted to shore up Christianity with the new understandings that liberal perspectives would bring, we're looking to really take what we would today call dialectical steps. So what we have in these four different methods is we have four different dialectical steps taken over perhaps maybe 100-year period or so, going back to Schleiermacher, coming up through Kant, Hegel, later the young Hegelians, Marx, and then sort of at the close, we'll have here, for example, Nietzsche, Camus, Sartre. And so we have this long discursive engagement between these modernistic idealists who are moving away from a traditional Christianity in favor of something else, even if the something else is in their mind still a Christianity. Of course, that's the case for people like Kant or Schleiermacher. Even Hegel still thought he was maintaining an authentic Christian faith as he was taking these dialectic steps. But of course, by around the time of the young Hegelians, thinkers like David Strauss, we see a break in this, and we see the secularistic tendencies taking over. And so if you think of each of these methods as different phases in an interaction, a discourse with Christianity, a conversation. And so you see the first, you can almost maybe perhaps think of these as waves, even though to some degree the waves might overlap or have similar content. So I think Professor Bavinck is really showing us by these methods and these breakouts that modernists did not come up to Christians, traditional Christianity, knock on their door and put 95 theses to the wall of Christianity and everything was done. In fact, these dialectical steps show a long drawn out engagement over, maybe 100-year period or so. And so I think that's why we really want to see, and why you and I have spent so much time talking about each one of these methods, because modernism and its intellectual descendants, postmodernism, epiphenomenalism, transcendentalism, other existentialism, other sorts of all of these movements, one of the reasons why they have such a robust criticism against Christianity is because they incorporate the discourse from these four methods over 100 years or so. And I think sometimes we in Reformed theology think that modern liberals are, well, for lack of a better word, dumb or stupid or uneducated or ill-informed. And the fact is that they may be wrong, but I don't believe any of those labels apply to the people Bavinck is profiling in each of these four methods. Now, that was a long intro to the ethical psychological method. And I want to get into the specifics of this one because, to some degree, the historical apologetic method is not the main school in today's modernism and postmodernism. The speculative method, the religious empirical method are largely older dialectic steps that are perhaps not in direct favor. However, I think you could go to any academic seminary in the Western humanities, the Geisteswissenschaften, and I think you could find that the ethical psychological method is still the core perspective that these modernistic and postmodernistic institutions are putting forward. For example, I would say the ethical psychological method is the key adopted method of the Barthians and post-Barthian in the years after Karl Barth's death. Is that where Barth was? Well, that's another question. But in the time since, it looks to me, as an observer seeing what's happened here, it looks to me like the ethical psychological method has absorbed the Barthian insights into its own independent, parallel neo-orthodoxy. And none of this is an accident. And I think that the average Reformed reader who doesn't understand that there's a long history of engagement in ideas between classic Protestant orthodoxy and these modern liberal and postmodern schools of thought, you're going to step into a meat grinder. You're going to be dealing with people who are very well versed in the limitations of classic Protestantism. And I don't mean limitations in the sense of doctrinal inaccuracy, limitations in the sense of product and marketing and brand. I almost see the success, quote unquote, of modernism and postmodernism and the secular Enlightenment movement in overthrowing Christianity in the West. I see that a success in product marketing, in branding, in sales. So people in this movement have recognized that to some degree, Western civilization is an audience looking to be sold a product to. And that product is wisdom. And classic Protestantism has for a long time said, we've got the scriptures. Come read the scriptures. Be enlightened. Psalm 19, the word of the Lord is pure, enlightening the eyes. But over the last 150 to 200 years, this other approach from the secular Enlightenment has really made a different claim. That stuff, that orthodoxy, that Calvinism, that Reformed theology, complicated. It's built on medieval backward thinking. It's atavistic. It's what we believed before we came into our period of smartness from these dialectical steps. And so because of that, don't even go there. Just start right here, right now. There's a user-friendliness to this. There's a reason why this is taught in the universities. And it's not just a cop-out. It's not just an intellectually vapid approach, as some of my Reformed friends sometimes question. Boy, why don't more people like Reformed theology? Why do they go to university and drool over the opportunity to take courses in religious departments, reading Nietzsche, reading Sartre, Camus, reading Marx, reading others, Hegel, Kant, Schopenhauer, And the point is long ago, the audience was captured by a superior branding and product marketing. I'm not saying more doctrinally accurate. I'm not saying better. I'm not saying correct. But to the degree that there's a utilitarian soft edge around the liberal humanity, I think we classic Protestant Orthodox folks have really been outplayed. Now, Chuck, we might be behind in Western civilization. It might be the fourth quarter, and we may be down 35-7, to use a football game analogy. We may be in the eighth inning or ninth inning, and to use a baseball analogy, and we may be down 7-2 going late into this game. But I don't think we're out, and I think Professor Bavinck is going to help us build through here. Now, I want to build out the ethical psychological method in specific to really show its power, to show what Professor Bavinck's trying to communicate about it. But before I do that, I just wanted to set the stage with this broad sweep and to talk. In my mind, these are the crown jewels of why modernism and postmodernism are so successful in the marketplace of ideas today. And I wanted to bounce that off of you and see what you thought from your perspective.
Yeah, and one point that you made there, which I just want to underline that you really did a good job of pointing out, is that this is an intellectually rigorous method of thinking. It's not that somebody just said, "Oh, me hate Christianity, me find new way to attack." It isn't that, and in fact, as you've pointed out, there are many who are quoted here by Bavinck who absolutely, I think we would consider them in the kingdom. We may, who knows, maybe in the new heavens and the new earth, we'll get to debate with some of them, or they may know better by then. So, and they may get to debate with themselves to some extent. But and he points out even that there is a long history, that while the method, this ethical psychological method, especially as it expresses itself in Kant and in post-Kantian thinkers, gathers it all together with a neat kind of bow and in a particular direction. He points out that there are folks well before, going all the way back. He says the line of argument for the truth of Christianity is very old. This line of argument basically saying that Christianity is true because of these ethical psychological arguments that we make. And he says it goes back to people like Tertullian, who's one of the ancient fathers, and in many apologists, we see this done. Scotus points out the rationality of the content of revelation, and many Catholic and Protestant theologians really do look, to these types of arguments for their proof of the truth of revelation. He does point out, of course, though, that still, until you get to Kant, some of these other methods, play a role. He points out Pascal, for example, very much still considers the historical proofs as a necessary element in his apologetic. He valued them personally. Vinay as well didn't spurn these historical proofs, even though he attaches greater value to the internal evidence. But this sense in which we look to internal evidence, that we look to the internal rationality, the internal consistency of Christian views, and how practically those Christian views work out in certain ways, and lead to things like a lot of the success of Europe and in the West probably can be tied to some of these ideas. A lot of good things that have happened in the world, in science and in health, can be tied to these views. And so it's not entirely, to maybe it's a little bit of a pun, but it's not entirely irrational to use this method. The problem really comes when this method becomes the be-all and end-all, and what does it lead to then, right? And so you've got Kant, I think, probably was some kind of a Christian. We might have some real difficulty with some of the things he said. Ritschl, similarly. But yet there is this sense that even today, people in the historical Jesus movement and those kinds of things, these are not people who are wide-eyed, defenders of atheism necessarily. There are people who hold to these views who consider themselves well within Christianity. And I think that's important to point out for a couple of reasons. And so I appreciate that you did that. One is because there is value into engaging with these ways of thinking. And in fact, there is some value in understanding some of the ways of thinking. And there is some truth in these ways of thinking. It's just that when we make these ways of thinking the only truth or the only possible way of looking at things, when we ignore some of the more, whether it's transcendental or at least, move away from just simply rational and practical reason, that's the problem that we run into. But there is much to be learned here. And I think that's why Bavinck spends all this ink in engaging with it, because I think he also found it value to engage and a value to engage. And when you do that, you learn, and not only do you perhaps gain the good, the wheat, in those thoughts, but hopefully you're also able to engage in a way that you can discard the chaff and not only that, but perhaps engage in a way that shows the problems with going, entirely in that direction. All I'm really doing here is putting an underline under some of the things that you said, but I think those are, it's important to do just that, to underline some of those things.
Thank you, my friend. Thank you. Now, it's worth going through Professor Bavinck's text. However, I would shortcut. I would jump over in my explanation, and I will tonight, because we have the advantage of history and the hindsight that history provides that Professor Bavinck did not have when he wrote this excellent description. How could I tell you what the ethical psychological method is rooted around? And Bavinck talks about the legacy of Kant. He talks about Albrecht Ritschl. He talks about the search for the unity of believing and knowing. He talks about the role of critique. All of these are huge and important and essential. But for most of our people listening today, there's really a simpler and quicker way of understanding through example. And that's this. When we think about the public, I don't mean ministry in the Christian sense, but when we think about the role that public intellectuals like Jordan Peterson play, Peterson is Jungian. Jung was arriving on the scene along with Freud as Bavinck was leaving the scene. And so while they overlapped in terms of their life, I think perhaps Bavinck's career was winding down as theirs was winding up. And probably Bavinck did not perhaps see the full impact that Jung would have in embodying so much of this ethical psychological method. I believe the Reformed Dogmatics notes that we're reading here were published in, I think, 1894, 1895 on the later end. So that's clearly pre-Jung and even pre-Freud in terms of them in their own personalities capturing so much of what would define this ethical psychological approach. So Bavinck is writing this, anticipating in some sense Freud and Jung. We have this history now. We have this very strong familiarity with them. We have access to archetypes, for pun intended here, in the sense of Jordan Peterson, really exemplifying what it means to take and apply and appropriate so many of the pieces of this ethical psychological method in his own epistemology, in his own ontological description. And I would say that anybody who has a familiarity with Jordan Peterson perhaps is already introduced to so many of the basics. And for those who do not have that introduction, Peterson has written a very helpful book describing his particular Jungian approach called The Maps of Meaning. And I would recommend that as very helpful and insightful reading. Now, what's the hook? What's the way into this ethical psychological method? Well, to some degree, the historical apologetic method, the speculative method, the religious empirical method, these three previous methods were in some sense battering rams or billy sticks or clubs used to defeat classical Protestantism, Protestant orthodoxy. Think here, Luther and Calvin, the classic creeds and confessions of the Protestant faith. These challenges that came up in these 120 years, in these first three dialectic steps, were largely about discrediting. Oh, look at the silliness, look at the foolishness that these pre-moderns have engaged in building their theology. Look at Luther, he doesn't know these things. Look at Calvin, he's not aware of the enlightened progress we've made since then. And so much of these dialectical steps are about banishing the Christianity that the modern enlightened movements would like to replace. But here's the issue. Having banished Christianity, people still keenly felt their need. They still keenly felt, hey, there was something that happened when I took part in that old classic orthodoxy. You know, when I participated in the rituals, when I studied the scriptures, when I tried to understand them, the modern thinker would say, I found a connection with what the Bible calls the peace that passes all understanding. Chuck, you and I would say that's a valid and genuine connection. But what happens is as the moderns are throwing out the foundations of classic religion, classic Christendom, they are denuding things that even their own followers found utilitarian. And so in the ethical psychological method, you see an approach to bring back and explain and account for, why did I feel good when I went Christmas caroling? Why was it so relevant, and why was there such a spiritual food to my soul when I attended church, when I performed acts associated with the sacraments, when I participated in ministries of hope, ministries of charity as a part of the church? All of these things were extremely utilitarian. And even if, in the mind of many modern thinkers, the classical Christianity had been defeated, there was still this undeniable sense of wholesomeness that was obtained from them that is now up in the air. And so the ethical psychological method really takes the phenomenalism of modernity and in some sense deifies this human need for God and morality. And all of the things, all of the concepts that were embodied in these religious types and figures now have to be recreated or re-explained or reimagined. Now, a good word for us, Chuck, is reconstructed. And so if the process of dissolving the old classical Christianity is deconstruction, you have to then reconstruct something in its place. And so the ethical psychological method is the way of doing that. Now, what do we have in the psychology of Carl Jung and intellectual descendants like Jordan Peterson? You have these archetypes, and these archetypes are stories, they're narratives, they're literature that explain why the human beast, why the human psyche is drawn to certain things, why some values keep manifesting over and over again, and why religion might have had insights. Now, this is according to Jungian archetypal perspective. You know, religion might have provided some level of insights, but now, because of science, because of modern psychology, we have insights into the human person that transcend those old limited stories. And so we're starting to talk through that. And a way I wanted to communicate this, first of all, if you're familiar with Dr. Jordan Peterson, how he explains the Bible, you can perhaps go no further, because he will explain the biblical stories, but rather than doing it from a classic Protestant Orthodox perspective, he will use the Jungian archetypes to bring the biblical stories to life in this Jungian way. Now, I have one example of this. It's not Jordan Peterson. It is an article that, as of the date you and I are recording today, just came out today from a Substack that I really like to read, very impressed with. It's called The Living Philosophy. And the article is called Archetypal Apocalypse. And let me read from that article. And here we're going to see the pressing need to reconstruct all of the things that used to be quote unquote Christian, that the deconstructionists were trying to destroy, but could not destroy. And now we have to reinvent alternative explanations for them. Now, here I'm reading from the article. The idea of an impending end of the world is an idea that just won't die. Now, that's the opening line to this article, Archetypal Apocalypse. And there's a picture of Greta Thunberg right there. Now, continuing, to the skeptical, atheistic mind, this idea of Judgment Day seems like an artifact of magical thinking that should have faded with the decline of religion and the rise of secular society. But this most secular century and a half in history has been characterized by a more urgent, more strongly apocalyptic set of myths than any culture preceding it. Chuck, in the opening paragraph, we see the raison d'etre for why this method is needed, this ethical psychological method. Magical thinking, as atheists would like to portray Christianity, as the atheists have destroyed Christianity's influence, things that should have faded have in fact become more urgent, more impressed upon the mindset of people. And in this idea, this article is talking about the idea of the apocalypse. And what's the thesis? As Western society has become more secular, ideas of the apocalypse are even more urgent and strong than they were under the religious reign and rule. That's a problem. And so this method has to explain that. The human need for God and morality. Now, here are some examples. In the late 19th century, the article says, there was Marx's fervent prophecy. Listen to this religious language of the imminent and inevitable revolution of the proletariat. We've had wars to end all wars, threats of imminent nuclear annihilation, and in the 20th century, a terror of ecological catastrophe hanging over us. We even have a doomsday clock, which in its 70-something years has never been more than 17 minutes from midnight. The secular age has been an age of apocalyptic thinking. Never has religion been so far from the mainstream and the end of the world so close. There is something in this idea that bewitches us. In this installment, we are going to separate the objective status of those apocalyptic predictions and instead focus on the possibility that humanity has psychological need for apocalypse. To paraphrase Jung, the psychological aspect is so impressive that one almost must regret that the apocalypse seems to be real after all. We are going to set aside the objective truth of these apocalyptic predictions and hone in on the psychological element at play in apocalyptic thinking and see if there isn't something about the idea of the end game that nourishes a deep need in our culture and perhaps all human culture. Now, Chuck, there's more to talk about in this particular article. But the point is this: having just banished Christianity, the ethical psychologicalists are now in the business of reconstructing. And it's this human need. What kind of a human need? It's this self-centered, it's this phenomenal need for God and for morality. Now, they're going to be very careful, not the God of the Bible, not the Christian God of the classic Orthodox understanding, Luther, Calvin, not that one, but something else that comes through our need. And so in some sense, in this ethical psychological method and the way it's talked about here, we see this, dare I say it, Schleiermachian reconstruction of the Christian faith. Wow. Chuck, what do you think about that example and the idea of how the Bible is being reinterpreted by today, even today, 120 years after Professor Bavinck? People are still, Professor Peterson is selling out lectures where he talks about the Bible and applies these kind of Jungian archetypes. What do you think about all of that?
It's very interesting. I appreciated listening to your reading that article, and even just as I was listening, trying to make connections here. And so in that short period of time, I'm not sure how much comment I have other than to say how it makes sense, right? We've talked about how we often as Christians, I talk about this God-shaped hole in people's hearts, right? And we believe that. We believe that we have been created to have a relationship with God. That's part of the Imago Dei, right? Is this desire to have a relationship with God. God created us to be in communion with each other, but also with him, to worship him. And given that we believe that, it is entirely, I think it should be entirely expected that there are going to be attempts to fill that hole, that God-sized hole in the heart. And that can be done in any number of ways, but it also has to be explained, right? Now, those who don't think too much about the explanation, they fill it in various ways, right? There are different ways that can be done. And interestingly, I think this idea of the apocalypse and apocalyptic thinking, I think we see that pretty regularly, and we see it from all sorts of folks. It's interesting how it's become more popular in recent years, but there's always been a thread of the popularity of some kind of what we now call dystopian fiction, right? There's always been that to some extent, but especially in recent years, there's been a real explosion in dystopian fiction, and it's really and it in all sorts of genres. It's expanded that we see that, and I think the writer of this Substack article has picked up on something that, in many ways, if we cannot fill that God-shaped hole in our heart, and we have this emptiness within us, naturally, I think we go to apocalyptic thinking, trying to blow up, as it were, the things of this world, because we see the problems with them. And yeah, it was really listening to you read from and discuss that article. It made a great deal of sense to me. And I think what it also does is it once again points us to, first of all, that there is a basis for this way of thinking. It's not just simply out of the blue, somebody made it up, just as a way to attack Christianity or to put an end to sort of the power structure of the pre-modern church. That there may have been today, there may be some of that impetus, but that's really not the initial reason for this way of thinking. The initial reason for this way of thinking is to try to explain that. And even some within this way of thinking, as Bavinck points out, people like Ritschl, tried to place God in that God-shaped hole, but to do it in their own terms, and make that God that they place into that God-shaped hole into their own image. And that small g God that has been created by human rationality and human feeling and human intellect is not the same as the one true God, capital G. And so this small g God, just as the idols, just as Baal and Dagon in the Old Testament, and just as the various gods of the Greek pantheon and the Roman pantheon could not fill that God-shaped hole, just as ideas of wealth and materialism could not fill that hole, or of Marxism could not fill that hole. Similarly, this small g God created in human image can't fill it either. And the realization that this hole still exists, I think, can lead people to move into these apocalyptic ways of thinking as a way of first of all coping, and second of all trying in some ways to explain what it is that they're experiencing. So I appreciated your including this article. I thought that it was very, very helpful. I think one of the things that maybe as we begin to wrap up here today to think about is, so what did you think of Bavinck's responses? What did you think of how he then challenges these worldviews? And what can we learn from how Bavinck responds, given that he's doing this still in the late 19th century? What today, here in 21st century America, what can we gain from Bavinck's response and his evaluation of these various theological methods as it relates to faith? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I think Bavinck is the gold standard for us in in this Reformed tradition. Some of the takeaways, and I want to be brief here because I know we're pushing our discussion time, but I think Bavinck points out, in a sense, Bavinck is able to do an internal critique of these methods, and he's able to do that internal critique because he is fairly well versed in what they're saying. He's able to apply their own methods and their own presuppositions, and then start to question, critique, interact with where this might lead. So in other words, the human need for God and morality. Well, if we've thrown out Christianity in the first three methods by deconstructing it and showing that there's nothing special in Christianity, it's just another religion. There's nothing supernatural there. It's just another religion. And yet we face this human need for God and morality. And the modern reconstruction has to happen. But I think Professor Bavinck asked, did we not perhaps throw out the baby with the bathwater? And what justifies this modern reconstruction versus what we were throwing out to get to it? The same thing with the legacy of Kant. Where did the continental thinking, to use a loose statement, where did the continental thinking get us? And we find out that there are some vast limitations in an analytical approach, in this synthetic method, this idea that Kant wished to find pure reason. What about with ritual and the morality? Well, morality is built upon certain modern presuppositions that some behavior is moral and other behavior is immoral or amoral. But why might that be? We find that even if we dismiss Christianity as old and outdated and not worthy of consideration, we then have to discuss why any principles should take their place and their limitations. So the famous example is the God delusion, why religion poisons everything. I think that is Christopher Hitchens' book, if I remember correctly. And so his subtitle, Why Religion Poisons Everything. That's a moral appeal, but it's based upon the presupposition, the foundation, that poison is bad. Why is poisoning bad? This is the groundwork that has to be done, and Bavinck points this out. Finally, the search for the unity of believing and knowing. Having beaten Christianity over the head for 100 to 120 years for its quote-unquote dogmas, and if I could just give a sustained modern critique of classic Protestantism, dogmas bad. There we go, Chuck, I said it. 2 words, dogmas bad. And so we see so much of the modern tip of the spear was focused on puncturing the balloon of Christianity. You don't actually know what you believe in. You just believe it. And there's a difference between believing and knowing. And usually that difference turns out to be pure reason in the case of Kant, also categorical imperatives, ways that we can reason from there. But at the end of the day, you Christians only believe you have the truth. And we moderns know something. Why do we know? Well, we have things like science. We have things like these modern methods, and they're so much better. But as soon as you start poking back, as Professor Bavinck does, at the foundations, what about this unity of believing and knowing that you moderns say Christianity lacks? But then we Christians start turning the same spear back around at your worldview and start poking you with the tip of the spear. And soon enough, this search for unity really seems to point out that the moderns are standing on grounds of religious faith as much as the Christians were. And then finally, Bavinck points out about critique. Well, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. And if we can pour acid all over your worldview and deconstruct it, well, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. We can do the same. We can take acid and pour it over the modern sensibilities. And we find that these dialectical steps haven't taken us as far as we thought. And I think that was the big gain that Professor Bavinck shows in this part of the chapter. So let me throw it over to you, Chuck, for some final thoughts to pull that all together.
Yeah, no, I think you did a good job of doing just that. I think the one thing that I would just say, really just finish up, I would quote from Bavinck himself here at the very end on page 559, the very last couple of paragraphs in this chapter. There's so much here to what he says, but so I'm just going to read sections of what he says, because I'm not sure I could do it any justice trying to explain it. He says, Christianity does not consist in the revolution of the conflict between subject and object, but in reconciliation between God and humanity. And if Christianity is indeed a religion of redemption, then the revelation from which it has sprung also includes the communication of truth, the discovery and liberation from falsehood. Then word and fact, prophecy and miracle, illumination and regeneration also combine to support that truth. Subjectively, cognition and trust are always they are always united in that faith. Objective religion then is not the product of subjective religion, but given in divine revelation that we should walk in it. And dogma is not merely a symbolic interpretation of the spiritual life, but an expression, be it a human one, of the truth God has given in his word. I don't know that I could sum it up any better than what Bavinck said right there.